So now that we have some of the terminology down, let's go a little bit deeper and kind of practice and relate these new terms to databases and start to talk about relationships a little bit. So in this diagram, you can see three tables, two additional ones that we're talking from. So we still have the student table with the number of attributes, 4 rows. We have another entity or table called class, once again with 4 attributes and a number of rows, just records describing the class. And then we have grades in there. But if you look at this, if I told you what student got a 3.0 in what class, could you tell me how to get to that relationship? Could you tell me what class it was? Could you tell me what student it was that you were able to get to that information? I hope as you're looking on that, you really can't tell. There's really no relationship. What you can tell, though, is a primary key. And this is a new term that we're introducing for the first time. And what a primary key is a unique identifier on a row that describes that row and is unique to the entire table or the entire entity. So if you look at student number here, each student has a different student number. They're unique within this entity, within this table. Same thing with class. If you look at class number, every class number is different and it is never both of these can be considered primary keys. And one thing that I'll also call out is some primary keys are surrogate keys. And a surrogate key is essentially a machine generated ID that allows a particular record or a row inside of a table to be unique by creating a new number in some sequence. And typically, this is done by business analysts giving requirements to data engineers. And as the data is being loaded, these data engineers apply a surrogate key. And if you can think about Northern Illinois, your ZID really has no value to you. It's a number that the university assigned to you. And essentially, it's random. There's no rhyme or reason that I can see from why the ZID is used, but it does uniquely help you identify you to Northern Illinois University. And there's two reasons that we would want to do it. One is for performance, and I'm not going to get into some of the performance reasons for that. This class isn't looking to train you as a DBA, but keep in mind there are some performance reasons on why you would use a surrogate key. The other reason is for situations like mergers and acquisitions. And I'll take a fictitious example. Suppose NIU and SIU wanted to merge together as one university, and they both use the same system to onboard students. What is the likelihood in that case that both ZI numbers potentially could be held by a student at NIU and a student at SIU? Well, if they're using the same system and they hadn't been coordinating up to this point, it's very likely that there is going to be some duplication or some overlap. Much like in a merger and acquisition, random customer numbers could overlap with each other. So the idea of combining a surrogate key based off of the business rule of a current ZID and what university created it could allow us to create rules that would be able to create uniqueness for us. But as we continue at grade, we don't see a primary key. You see numbers that do, in some cases, repeat themselves. So in this case, we can't say that this table has a primary key. So really, all this is, as we mentioned earlier, it's just data. There's no information that we can really get from here to be able to use the data in all three of these tables to combine it to get any information, any knowledge, anything that we can take action of based off of the tables that in this current status. So how do we go about resolving that? Well, we've already talked about one of the key ones is a primary key to uniquely identify a value in a given table. But the second one is the concept of a foreign key. And a foreign key is an attribute or an additional field in a table, but it is not the primary key of that table, but it is a primary key of another table. And I know that sounds a little confusing the first time you hear it, so we're going to go through an example here to help illustrate this a little bit better. In this example, we have three different tables. We have an email table, a student table, and an office visit table. And each of them has a primary key. most likely a surrogate where a machine generated it to keep uniqueness to it. So every time an email is sent out, we have a unique number here. Same thing with student. Every student in our table, in our entity, has a unique number. And then lastly, office visit, same thing. Every time an office visit comes in, you have a unique number. Well, notice, even though this number and this number are the same, because they're in different tables, it does not break any rule. The tables are allowed to have primary key values within different tables that do not have a relationship to each other. Where the relationship comes into play is through a foreign key. And while each of these numbers for email table is unique, you will notice all the way over here on the right-hand side, we have a value called student number. And each student number is related to the actual student who sent it out. And in this case, you'll see that student 1325 has sent out 2 emails. But it doesn't break our rule because the primary number is still unique. Yet what this allows us to do is to take this foreign key, this value for that student number, which is not the primary key in email, and help us relate it to the student number in the student table, which is the primary key. So once again, a foreign key is the ability or the appearance or presence of a value that relates to the primary key in another table. Same thing with office visit. Student number. You're able to take the value for each student number that did an office visit and relate it back to the student table to get information. And by creating these relationships, you can now start to gain information. And in this particular example, hypothetically, you wanted to do a correlation between emails, the number of emails that went out, and the number of office visits a student has. You now have the ability to relate all of those tables together, even though there's no direct relationship between office visit and email without going through the student table. And if we go back and kind of relate that to our original example where we had student, class, and grade, in this case, student remains the same, class remains the same, but in the grade table, we've now added a student number and a class number. And by doing this now, you can relate grades to the class and to the student because grade now has a foreign key for student number and it has it for class number. And in this first line here of the grade 3.7, you can tell that Sam got a 3.7 grade in Chemistry 101, the fall term, section 1. And while these two values are foreign keys, the combination of both of them actually makes up a new term that we're going to introduce now called a compound key. And primary keys do not have to be one column. A primary key can be 2 or more columns that uniquely identify a record or a row in a table. And while the foreign keys here make up the primary key, you can see in our previous example, that doesn't necessarily have to stay true, where a foreign key does not necessarily have to make up part of the primary key. But in some cases for compound keys, and you will see examples as we go throughout the class, they do. So I just want to pause here and just kind of go through those terms as we have 3 tables. The student table has 4 different attributes. It has 4 rows. Within each table now, we have a student number, which makes up the primary key, a class number that makes up the primary key, and both the student number and the class number are a compound key that together make up the primary key. And within each of those, the student number is a foreign key to the student table, and the class number is a foreign key to the class table. And while we're going to be going over much more when we get to future sections in SQL, we want to just call it a few rules that a primary key cannot be null. And we'll get more into the definition of null, but it has to have a value. A null means nothing. It means I cannot identify it. And by definition, you need to identify if something is unique to be classified as a primary key. Where on the other hand, a foreign key is allowed to be null, which simply indicates that while there's a record for that value, the relating table does not have a corresponding record for that foreign key to be populated. So primary keys cannot be null. Foreign keys in some situations can be null. But once again, we'll go over that in about 2 weeks to really go a little bit deeper into foreign keys. So a quick little exam here. I'm going to ask some questions. Feel free to pause the video as we go through here, but really want to make sure that you understand these concepts. So if you look at this table, or I'm sorry, this screen, how many different entities do you see on the screen? The correct answer is 4. Student, lab section, lab exercise, student lab. For lab section, what would be the primary key? Lab section would be the primary key for lab section. And I think that's poor naming, but kind of see the point in here. How many different rows or records would there be for student? There are 3 records in the entity student. What would be a foreign key, or how many foreign keys can you see amongst these 4 entities? Well, one is lab section here could relate to this primary key, so that's a foreign key. Username here is a foreign key to username up here. Lab exercise number 1 can be a foreign key to this primary key over here. So if you didn't understand that, kind of go back, look at it again, but we have kind of the breakout here where you have the primary keys, you have a foreign key, you have other foreign keys in this diagram. And keep in mind, these 2 foreign keys together make up a compound key, which ultimately creates the primary key for the student lab exercise. And if we go back to our original example and we kind of map this out, hopefully you can kind of see the relationships and not actually have to physically look at the data to understand how these relationships are. When we do these modeling, you'll have indicators such as this little key which notes the primary key. And as we get into the modeling section, we'll talk a little bit about this notations that we have here, which describe the relationship in more detail between these tables. And a lot of your project, when you're modeling the tables for the fictional company that we'll talk about, this is something very similar that you'll be creating and developing on your own, not only the entities or the subject areas for the business, but how they relate together in a certain modeling techniques. So I'm going to run through these last parts pretty quickly, but as I mentioned, the database management system, also known as DBMS, SQL standing for structured query language, which we'll be getting into here on the next video, and really understanding not only the terms, but the abbreviations and the acronyms for those terms as well. This other information is really good to know, but as we go through this, what we really want to focus on is being able to understand the relationships in this model, understand what primary keys, what foreign keys are, and what entities, records, and attributes mean. So just kind of an exercise. I know you guys aren't together, so try to do this on your own, where you can think about a car auto shop and write down a few subject areas or a few entities. Maybe it's like cars in service. Maybe it's customer. Kind of think of those, and then jot down a few attributes that you think are related to those different entities, and see if you can't create the relationships using primary keys and foreign keys to be able to understand how you would go about modeling something, for example, a car repair shop, and see what kind of questions that you have, what kind of concerns you have. And as we go through the class, see if we answer those questions or if we want to have a side conversation to help you get a little bit deeper understanding. As I mentioned, really right now, understanding primary keys and foreign keys is going to be the key takeaway for the next few lessons. And we'll be getting much deeper into these concepts of these methods to this modeling exercise in weeks 4 to 6. But for right now, if you have these terms down, if you can kind of identify them, if I showed you on the graph, if you're comfortable from what you see in the homework, you should be in pretty good shape. So that's the end of the first module for week 1. And the next one will be an introduction to SQL that will finish up the content for week 1. Thanks a lot.